Distinguished ministers, briefers, ambassadors, and all those watching us today online. Let me welcome you on behalf of Estonia, Canada, Denmark, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America. Maintaining peace depends on how states treat their own citizens. There must be accountability between a state and a society, and this is the road to a less violent world. The unfolding tragedy in Belarus is proof of that. Grave human rights violations are threatening peace and security. The UN Security Council has made that link clear by stating that serious human rights violations are an early indicator of conflict with international implications. And this Council has also said that repression could amount to threats to international peace and security. And therefore, early warning and awareness raising is our job. And this is why we are discussing the crisis in Belarus here today. This is why we can't afford to remain silent in the face of mass violations of human rights. And this is why we give the floor to those being suppressed and silenced. And this is why we have invited Mrs. Svetlana Zhiyanovskaya, Mr. Valentin Stefanovic, and Ms. Olga Stachovich from Belarus to brief us today. Furthermore, I am glad to welcome the distinguished United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus, Madame Anaïs Marin. Allow me to make some organizational remarks. I would like to remind you that as this is an informal meeting, there will be no questions and right of replies. Today's meeting is being live-streamed via several channels, Facebook and YouTube, and you will also find webcast link on the website of Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Estonian Permanent Representation to the UN. The recording will remain publicly accessible after the event at the homepage of the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Let me now briefly introduce the order of today's meeting. We have over 30 speakers today, including 10 ministers, and we will first hear our distinguished briefers. Next, I will give the floor to the co-sponsors of today's meeting, and thereafter the Security Council members take the floor, and after that all others have the opportunity to speak. I am now glad to welcome here Madame Anaïs Marin, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus, who took up her mandate in November 2018. Please, Madame Marin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, permettez-moi de m'exprimer en français. Je vous remercie de me donner l'opportunité de dresser un premier bilan en termes de droits humains de la crise post-électorale qui traverse le Bélarus. La situation n'a jamais été aussi catastrophique qu'au cours du mois qui vient de s'écouler. C'est d'autant plus préoccupant qu'elle continue de se dégrader. Cette évolution sans précédent au Bélarus nécessite l'attention renouvelée de la communauté internationale, tant le risque est grand qu'un engrenage de violence ne vienne menacer la paix et la sécurité régionale. Je voudrais souligner 5 problèmes qui me semblent les plus graves. Premièrement, le processus électoral a montré combien le Bélarus limite le droit de ses citoyens à participer à la vie publique. Comme je l'indiquais dans mon rapport à l'Assemblée générale il y a 1 an, rien n'a changé, en droit et en pratique, qui aurait pu donner l'espoir que le Bélarus satisferait les critères internationalement reconnus pour des élections libres, équitables et transparentes. Les rapports disponibles indiquent que le processus a été entièrement manipulé. Le champ politique avait été préalablement nettoyé pour empêcher 3 des candidats les plus populaires de concourir. 2 ont été arrêtés avant le début de la campagne sur la base d'accusations politiquement motivées. Un 3e, qui n'aurait soi-disant pas réussi à réunir assez de signatures valides pour se présenter, a été poussé à l'exil. Des fraudes grossières au stade du décompte des voix, mises en évidence par les observateurs locaux et certaines commissions électorales honnêtes, illustrent combien la légitimité populaire fait défaut au président en exercice. Dès lors, sa volonté de rester au pouvoir après la fin de son mandat actuel apparaît comme la cause principale de la crise qui déstabilise le pays. La seconde, et c'est mon second point, tient au fait que le président et ses partisans refusent obstinément le dialogue, alors que ce serait l'unique moyen de réconcilier le peuple avec ses autorités, compte tenu des atteintes graves à la liberté de réunion pacifique que nous avons tous pu constater dès le soir du scrutin. L'annonce de la victoire de M. Loukachenko, avec 80% des voix, a en effet provoqué un vaste mouvement populaire, spontané et pacifique. Les Bélarusses sont massivement descendus dans les rues pour exprimer leur rejet des résultats officiels qui ne leur apparaissent pas comme crédibles. Une fois de plus, on leur a volé leur voix. Comme en 2010, ils ont été violemment empêchés d'exercer leur droit de réunion pacifique. La réponse des forces de l'ordre a été violente et disproportionnée. En 3 jours, plus de 6 000 personnes ont été arrêtées à travers le pays alors qu'elles participaient à ces marches pacifiques, ce qui s'ajoute aux quelques 1500 autres personnes arrêtées depuis avril. La plupart sont désormais libres, mais j'appelle les autorités à libérer toutes les personnes encore arbitrairement détenues. Comme vient de le rappeler le Comité des droits de l'homme dans son commentaire général de l'article 21 du Pacte international relatif aux droits civils et politiques, le droit de manifester pacifiquement est un pilier de la société démocratique et il peut s'exercer aussi bien en public qu'en ligne. En coupant l'accès à Internet pendant 3 jours, le gouvernement a tenté d'empêcher les électeurs de s'informer et de se coordonner via les réseaux sociaux. Un tel blocus sur les communications Internet est disproportionné et incompatible avec le droit à la liberté d'expression. Les manifestations spontanées se poursuivent cependant quotidiennement depuis 4 semaines et ont gagné tous les pans de la société, des ouvriers aux étudiants. Faute de pouvoir trouver les meneurs de ce soulèvement populaire d'un nouveau type, la police a employé la force, de manière excessive et non justifiée, pour interpeller indistinctement des manifestants, des journalistes, des passants, des femmes et même des enfants. Certains ont été capturés en pleine rue par des hommes en civil et sans insigne. La plupart ont été sauvagement battus. Cela m'amène à mon 3e point. Au cours de cette vague de répression aveugle et brutale, nous ont été rapportés pas moins de 450 cas de torture commis par des agents de l'État. Des témoignages concordants montrent le caractère systématique des violences infligées par la police anti-émeute et les gardiens des prisons, dans lesquelles des milliers d'innocents ont été parqués à partir du 9 août. Tous auraient reçu des coups et blessures, beaucoup sont mutilés, voire invalides. Au moins 5 personnes auraient succombé. Entassés dans des cellules prévues pour 4 personnes, avec un accès limité à l'eau, les détenus ont subi des traitements humiliants et dégradants. On m'a informé de cas de viol, perpétrés à l'aide de matraques, d'électrocution et d'autres formes de torture physique et psychologique. Diffusées dans le monde entier, ces images ont choqué la communauté internationale. Il appartient à l'État bélarusse de tout faire pour prévenir, instruire et punir ces crimes d'autant plus graves qu'ils ont été commis de manière préméditée et organisée. Quant aux personnes qui ont subi ces sévices, elles sont dans un tel état de choc post-traumatique qu'elles nécessitent une aide humanitaire d'urgence. J'appelle les autorités à faire toute la lumière sur ces tragiques événements et à garantir aux victimes le droit d'obtenir réparation. Je recommande l'instauration d'un mécanisme international indépendant pour enquêter sur ces crimes et j'encourage les autorités à coopérer avec lui, tout comme avec les procédures spéciales de l'ONU et mon mandat en particulier. 4e, même si cela fait 25 ans que l'état de droit n'est pas respecté au Bélarus, c'est le non-droit qui semble régner dans le pays depuis quelques semaines. Il ne peut y avoir de justice si elle est subordonnée au pouvoir exécutif, si elle est expéditive, opaque, et qu'elle ne fonctionne plus que dans un sens, je dirais même à l'envers. Alors qu'ils sortent tout juste de détention, des manifestants victimes d'abus sont maintenant poursuivis en justice pour, je cite, troubles à l'ordre public. C'est le cas d'un enfant de 16 ans, battu si violemment qu'il est tombé dans le coma le 12 août. À peine sorti de l'hôpital, il vient d'être mis de nouveau en détention, sans avoir pu porter plainte pour les violences qu'il a subies. Aucune plainte pour torture n'a encore été examinée, et leurs auteurs semblent confiants qu'ils ne seront pas poursuivis. Les journalistes et blogueurs, cibles privilégiées des répressions, sont maintenant poursuivis pour avoir soi-disant organisé ou coordonné des manifestations non autorisées. Dans un pays qui muselle la liberté d'opinion et d'expression, qui harcèle systématiquement les médias indépendants, qui a jeté des dizaines de blogueurs en prison incriminer des journalistes et continuer de restreindre l'accès à Internet pour empêcher les Bélarusses et le monde de savoir ce qui se passe à huis clos dans le pays est le comble du cynisme. Ceci m'amène à mon cinquième et dernier point. Outre la guerre insensée que mène le gouvernement contre son propre peuple, on assiste à une internationalisation du conflit dans la sphère informationnelle. Les soutiens étrangers du pouvoir vacillant véhiculent des informations fallacieuses qui visent à discréditer et déstabiliser ce mouvement populaire pour étendre artificiellement les chances du président sortant de se maintenir au pouvoir. Compte tenu de la gravité des faits rapportés, il est primordial de rappeler que les violations des droits de l'homme ne sont pas une affaire intérieure. Elles intéressent la communauté internationale, d'autant plus lorsqu'existe un risque aussi flagrant d'escalade de la violence. Lorsqu'un gouvernement annonce être prêt à utiliser l'armée contre ses propres concitoyens en temps de paix, qu'il accuse sans fondement ses voisins d'ingérence et d'agression, et qu'il est prêt à sacrifier la souveraineté du pays et l'indépendance de ses institutions pour se maintenir en place coûte que coûte, c'est la paix et la sécurité internationale qui me semblent menacées. C'est pourquoi j'en appelle toutes les parties prenantes à la raison et à la retenue. La seule issue possible à cette crise sans précédent est le dialogue, qui doit être ouvert, honnête et inclure notamment la société civile. Je salue les offres de bons offices et de médiation multilatérale qui pourraient accompagner cette transition politique qui semble désormais inéluctable, car elle est déjà en cours. La société bélarusse, que j'étudie depuis plus de 10 ans, a considérablement changé, et elle s'est découvert, au cours des derniers mois, une capacité de résilience unique, qui est une source d'inspiration pour tous ceux dans le monde qui aspirent au respect de leurs droits fondamentaux. Montrons-nous dignes de sa confiance et protégeons les droits et libertés de ceux qui aspirent à ce changement démocratique. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Thank you, Madame Marin, for bringing your expertise to this debate. And Madame Marin's speech in English will be posted via Twitter. Let me now introduce our distinguished briefer, Mrs. Svetlana Zhiyanovskaya, a former presidential candidate and the leader of the National Movement for Democracy and Free Elections. She became candidate in presidential elections only after her husband, also one of the candidates, was arrested. After the elections, Mrs. Tsikhanouskaya was forced to flee to neighboring Lithuania. Mrs. Tsikhanouskaya, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, my country, Belarus, is in turmoil. Peaceful protesters are being illegally detained, beaten, and imprisoned. The protests themselves started after a cynical and blatant attempt by Mr. Lukashenko to steal the votes of the people. The demands of the nation are simple: immediate termination of violence and threats by the regime, immediate release of all political prisoners, and free and fair election. There is only one obstacle to these demands being met. This obstacle is Mr. Lukashenko, a man desperately clinging onto power and refusing to listen to his people and his own state officials. A nation cannot and should not be a hostage to one man's thirst for power, and it won't. Belarusians have woken up. The point of no return has passed. This is manifested now by daily demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of all across Belarus, despite police brutality and blatant disregard for Belarusian laws and international norms. This is manifested by the strikes across the largest factories and state-owned companies in Belarus, despite intimidation and, in some cases, unlawful layoffs. This is manifested by all the strata of our society and all the political spectrum demanding on one and the same thing. The regime of Mr. Lukashenko is morally bankrupt, legally questionable, and simply untenable in the eyes of our nation. The United Nations was created as a formal body of the whole international community in order to promote and encourage respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all. In 1945, Belarus was one of the founding members of the United Nations. Now we, the Belarusian people, need the help of the United Nations in order to stop blatant human rights violations and cynical disregard for human dignity right in the middle of Europe. We ask the United Nations to condemn the use of excessive force by the Belarusian security services against protesters. We suggest a special session of the United Nations Human Rights Council to discuss the human rights situation in Belarus. We urge the United Nations to send the immediate international monitoring mission to Belarus to document the situation on the ground. We demand to allow entry and free movement to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus. We demand immediate release of all political prisoners from arbitrary detention, including Sergei Tikhanovsky, Viktor Baka, Pavel Severinets, Olga Kovalkova, Sergei Delevsky, Mykola Statkevich, and dozens of other arrested civic society leaders. We demand the end to the intimidation and targeting of the members of the Coordination Council, Svetlana Alexievich, Olga Kovalkova, Pavel Latushka, Sergei Delevsky, Maria Kolesnikova, Maxim Znak, and others. I want to make it very clear. Collaboration with the regime of Mr. Lukashenko at the moment means the support for violence and blatant violation of human rights. I call on the international community to use all the mechanisms to stop the violence, including sanctions on the individuals that committed electoral violations and crimes against humanity. At the same time, I stress that Lukashenko does not represent Belarus anymore. Belarusians are lawful, peaceful, and responsible people with a high sense of personal and collective dignity, as they demonstrate every day, every single moment in the past weeks. We are ready and open to a dialogue with all sides, all parties, and all countries that respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Belarus. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mrs. Tsikhanouskaya, for being with us today. Our second briefer is Mr. Valentin Stefanovic. He is a member of the board of the Human Rights Center Viasna and Vice President of the International Federation for Human Rights. Mr. Stefanovic is a lawyer and human rights defender. The floor is yours, please.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to say thank you for this opportunity to have a speech today here, and very dramatic days for all Belarusian people, the days of struggle for freedom, struggle for human rights. The presidential election came with numerous cases of repression from the very beginning. Nevertheless, it gave rise to unprecedented enthusiasm and hopes for the changes. However, numerous violations and falsifications during the election process, and particularly during the absolutely intransparent vote counting, led to people's anger and frustration, as well as mass protests of the election day and the following days in all over Belarus. In anticipation of such developments, we, the representative of the Belarusian human rights organizations, addressed the authorities asking to steer clear of the use of violence and bloodshed. Unfortunately, the authorities did not hear us. Peaceful protesters were attacked by special police units, which showed the disproportionate use of violence and used riot control and other weapons. Hundreds of people were injured. At least 3 protesters died due to direct police actions, and over 7,000 were detained. Further events shocked our society even more. Detainees were subject to torture, cruel and inhuman treatment. Hundreds of people have been tortured. For several days, starting from August 9, Belarusian law enforcement officers performed actions that intentionally caused severe pain as well as physical and mental suffering of the citizens of Belarus. They inflicted bodily harm and psychological trauma. They did it various institutions of the law enforcement system, both in the process of detention and while in custody. The victims were subjected to torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. In particular, they were insulted, beaten with batons, maltreated, injured, bone fractures, wounds, and massive bruises, and electrocuted with stun guns and shot with rubber bullets. The police sprayed gas in closed spaces with the citizens inside, forced them to stand naked on their knees for hours on the asphalt, threatened them with the use of weapons and sexual violence. The detainees were deprived of sleep, hygiene products, food, and water, denied medical assistance and necessary medicines. In addition, the police held up to 40 people in cells designed for 4 to 6 people, including citizens with a confirmed COVID-19. The victims were massively subjected to measures of psychological pressure. They were forced to sing the national anthem of Belarus and shout slogans for a long time, to kneel down and to pledge loyalty for the current government and law enforcement agencies of Belarus. Many of victims were taken to hospitals after their release. Some were in critical condition and are still recovering. A large number of those arrested needed psychological therapy after their release. The Human Rights Center Viasna recorded more than 500 testimonies of the victims of torture. Victims testify that torture was massive and systemic and was used as a politically motivated punishment of citizens for expressing their opinion and participation in anti-government protests. We can definitely say that we are dealing with the crimes against humanity, which do not have time limit in our national legislation. However, currently the prosecutor office and investigation committee failed to start any criminal cases on these grounds. The repression intensified in the post-election period. At least 80 people are under criminal investigation for participation in protests. At present, there are 50 political prisoners behind the bars, including election contenders, their team members, bloggers, opposition activists, and participants of peaceful protests. The Belarusian human rights community and I, as a representative of Human Rights Center Viasna, continue to urge Belarus authorities to immediately stop the repression and violence against its citizens, to immediately release all political prisoners, to take measures for effective investigation of all acts of torture and follow their international obligations. Today, we observe a deep crisis of human rights in Belarus, which cannot be and is not an internal affair of the country. The whole world should be concerned about unprecedented violation of human rights and its own laws by the current government of Belarus. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Valentin Stefanovic, very much for sharing your views. And last but not least, I'm glad to introduce Ms. Olga Siakhovich, who is a legal expert and human rights campaigner from Belarus, who specializes in media and freedom of expression issues. Since 2013, she has collaborated with the Belarusian Association of Journalists, an NGO with the mission to protect the rights of journalists. The floor is yours, please.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank Estonia for the efforts made to have convened these two important meetings. I regret to tell that since the beginning of the 2020 presidential election campaign, the situation with freedom of speech in Belarus has deteriorated dramatically, as the authorities launched a violent crackdown trying to discourage journalists and bloggers from reporting on election-related protests. Since May, the authorities have stepped up their efforts to curb media coverage of the protest in Belarus. For 3 days after the election, which took place on the 9th August, internet access in Belarus was severely disrupted. At times, the blackout was total. At other times, specific internet services, websites, social networks, and messaging services were blocked. Access to a number of media websites was blocked as a result of the targeted actions of the government. One of the first to be blocked was the Belarusian Association of Journalists website, as was its hot mobile number for journalists. During 3 days of turbulent post-election protests, more than 70 Belarusian and foreign journalists were arrested, and 54 were kept in detention. Journalists were also the targets of brutal treatment on the part of the riot police. 25 journalists were beaten up, and 3 were wounded when the police fired rubber bullets and stun grenades at the protesters, and many had their equipment damaged and seized. Totally, there have been more than 150 arrests of journalists since the election campaign began, and 39 of them have been physically assaulted. Some of them are being prosecuted, often for work without accreditation or for alleged participation in illegal demonstration. Just today, 9 journalists are in jail, and 4 journalists have been sentenced to 3 days imprisonment just today. Despite these difficult and dangerous conditions, independent journalists continue to carry out their professional duties, telling the society the truth about the violent actions of the government. The Ministry of Information ordered internet service providers to block 75 news websites and websites of civil society organizations, including influential media outlets such as Belsat TV, the Belarusian service of Radio Liberty, and the independent news agency Belapan. Though the Belarusian Association of Journalists website did not appear on the blacklist, it has not been possible to access for 18 days. In addition to online media outlets, the influential newspapers Комсомольская правда, Народная воля, Белгазета, and Свободные новости have been targeted. The state printing house refused to print them, claiming technical problems. Then 2 of the newspapers printed their issues abroad. The state post service made impossible their disseminating despite being contracts. The Belarusian authorities took a number of special actions to prevent foreign journalists from covering the events in Belarus. Before the election, at least 30 journalists from foreign media outlets have applied to the Belarus Ministry of Foreign Affairs for an accreditation to work in the country, but received no response within the statutory period. As a result, they could not work legally because the Belarusian law on mass media prohibits foreign journalist activity without the accreditation. At least 17 foreign journalists were banned from entering Belarus at the Minsk airport. and several foreign journalists were deported from Belarus and had entry bans ranging from 5 to 10 years imposed on them. In recent days, the Belarusian Interdepartmental Commission on Security of the Information in the Information Sphere has proceeded to a massive cancellation of press accreditations issued to foreign journalists working for such media as Associated Press, BBC, Reuters, and others. There were 17 journalists deprived of their accreditation. With such gross violation of freedom of expression and the rights of journalists in particular, the Belarusian authorities are denying citizens' right to information. Freedom of expression forms the basis for full enjoyment of the wide range of other rights, in particular the right to assembly and the right to association, the cause of the right to vote, which are essential for peaceful resolution of political crises, like the current crisis in Belarus. We call on Security Council members and all UN member states to insist on respecting by Belarus the right to freedom of expression and to support the Belarusian people and Belarusian civil society in their actions aimed at the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to their political views. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ms. Siakhovich, very much for joining us with your valuable insights. We just heard our last briefer. I now invite the representatives of the co-sponsor countries to take the floor. In order to accommodate all the interventions, please limit your statements strictly to 3 minutes, and we will post the full version of your statement online, and please be so kind and send it to the email address you are seeing on the screen. I would now like to give the floor to the co-sponsors of this meeting. The first is United Kingdom Minister for the European Neighbourhood and the Americas, Ms. Wendy Morton, please.
Chairman, thank you for calling this meeting to discuss the alarming developments in Belarus. The UK welcomes this opportunity to hear from the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus and from representatives of Belarusian civil society. It is no secret that the UK has been shocked by the events we have seen unfold in Belarus. Our statements have been unequivocal. We do not accept the result of the presidential election of the 9th of August, and we share the concerns raised by the UN, including by the Secretary-General, 2 working groups and 4 special rapporteurs, including Ms. Marin, who is of course with us today. I will not list in detail the violations we have seen take place in Belarus. The speakers have shared their own experiences of these, but I will reiterate that the UK will not sit back silently when we see political candidates and their campaign teams, peaceful protesters or journalists subject to harassment and detention by the authorities on unclear grounds. When democratic values are ignored, electoral processes manipulated, and independent observers excluded. When violence is used against citizens, journalists, including representatives of the BBC and other international outlets, and others, including, appallingly, minors. The Belarusian authorities must cease brutalising protesters, release political prisoners, including members of the Coordination Council, and engage in constructive dialogue with the Council and wider civil society. The international community demands that the rights of the Belarusian people be respected and that those who have violated them be held accountable. An independent investigation through the OSCE into the electoral process and the violations that followed will be a critical step towards ensuring this accountability, as I made clear in my statement at the Special Permanent Council on the 28th of August. We are also prepared to use sanctions to hold those responsible to account, and we will be working with partners to explore all options. There are some who have intimated that geopolitics is playing a role in the concerns we are raising, or that third parties are intervening in Belarus's internal affairs to fuel demonstrations. Such claims are wholly false. All we are asking is for the Belarusian state to live up to the obligations it has to protect the rights of its own people. The UK has long worked in partnership with others to support civil society in Belarus, and I'm proud to be able to say today that the UK intends to double its support for independent media, human rights organisations and community groups in Belarus, with an extra £1.5 million for projects over the next 2 years. I'd like to conclude by thanking those who have briefed us today on their experiences, the expertise of Ms. Marin and the contributions of Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, Mr. Stefanovic and Ms. Siakhovich have been invaluable. Your bravery and determination to seek a more open, democratic future for the people of Belarus is highly commendable. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is United States of America Acting Deputy Permanent Representative, Ms. Charit Norman-Chalet.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We are delighted to co-host today's event with Estonia and the United Kingdom. I'd also like to thank Canada, Denmark, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine for co-sponsoring, as well as all the speakers and participants today who have taken the time to discuss this matter. I also want to thank Special Rapporteur Anaïs Marin for her presence and presentation this morning. The United States commends your dedication to human rights issues in Belarus and your determination to implement your mandate, despite facing restrictive obstacles. We encourage the government of Belarus to afford the Special Rapporteur access to the country in accordance with her mandate. I would also like to especially thank Ms. Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya for being with us today, and I'm sorry for not being able to say your name very well. But as Deputy Secretary of State Deegan noted in his remarks at the OSCE in Vienna on August 28th, we remain inspired by your courage and resolved to advocate for the Belarusian people in their peaceful demands to choose their own government and their own future. The Belarusian government must promote and protect the human rights and fundamental freedoms of its people. Instead, we see consistent abuses of the rights of peaceful assembly and freedom of association and expression, and these abuses must be addressed immediately. The United States vows to support Belarusian sovereignty and independence, and we call on all governments to do the same. However, it is clear to the world and to the people of Belarus that the August 9th election was fraudulent. Due to the scale of this fraud, the Belarusian people will never know the real outcome of their election. The United States strongly condemns the post-election brutality carried out by Belarusian authorities against peaceful protesters, including mass detentions and intimidation. We heard this directly from one of the presenters this morning. There must be an immediate end to all violence against the Belarusian people. We are deeply concerned about the reports of continued detention of members of the opposition, the apparent targeting of journalists for violence and detention, the dozens of people reported missing, and the use of internet shutdowns to hinder the ability of the Belarusian people to share and access information about the election and demonstrations. Continued arrests and detentions, including of labor leaders and journalists, must end. The United States does not seek to control or decide the destiny of the Belarusian people. This is also not a contest between East and West. This is a struggle between a ruler and the people he claims to represent. Time is of the essence, as we need to move expeditiously to avoid violence, intimidation, and harm to the people of Belarus. The OSCE is ready to engage now, and the United States supports the chairperson in office and the Troika as a means to facilitate dialogue within Belarus. I also want to reaffirm the call once again for the release of all of those unjustly detained. This includes an American citizen, Vitaly Zhiyanovskaya. Let me be clear. The President of the United States and the Secretary of State have no higher priority than the protection of American citizens falsely accused and held prisoner for crimes they did not commit. We call upon the Belarusian authorities to promptly release Vitaly and all those who are unjustly detained. The people of Belarus have a right to self-determination and are entitled to choose their own leaders through a truly free and fair election, one that is open to independent observation. Disparate elements of Belarusian society have come together to demand that their voices be heard for the future of their country. In this important moment, we reiterate that human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of expression and the right of peaceful assembly, must be respected. This will provide the foundation for those reforms necessary to bring about a democratic and prosperous future for the people of Belarus. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Lithuania Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Linas Linkevičius, please. Lithuania, you are not on air. Please put the mic on. Now it's okay.
Is it okay now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So thank you very much, and thank you, Estonia and Urmas. Thank you also for convening this important meeting. Allow me to support the people of Belarus in exercising their right to free, fair, and democratic elections. A station in Belarus after fraudulent election that could not be recognized neither free nor fair is a matter of our concern. We have to be clear, stating that due to numerous violations, President of Belarus lost his legitimacy, and present Belarusian authorities has proven their failure to represent interests of the people. We must be consistent in calling for peaceful transition of power and conduct new democratic election with international observation. We have to condemn clearly severe human rights violations in Belarus and growing repression of political opposition and civil society during and after the presidential elections campaign and election. Although these violations are outcomes of the systematic policies in Belarus over the past decades, but brutal manifestation of mass violence and imprisonment of peaceful demonstrators, including minors and journalists, are exceptional and warning. Institutionalized torture, enforced disappearances, alleged instances of sexual and gender-based violence, killings of the matters of concern of all international community. UN Human Rights Special Rapporteurs in their joint statement called on Belarus to stop torturing detainees and bring to justice police officers responsible for the humiliation of protesters, as the prohibition against torture is absolute under international human rights law, and it cannot be justified for any reason. UN Special Rapporteurs have already received reports of 450 documented cases of torture and ill treatment of people deprived of their liberty after the disputed presidential election. The international community must react jointly, forcefully and timely to the situation on the ground and call for an independent international investigation of severe human rights violations in Belarus. As a one concrete action, we should urge an international investigation on human rights, violence and crimes. It's also necessary to secure journalists and support the activities of human rights defendants acting in Belarus and abroad, encouraging determination of the citizens of Belarus in their path to democratic transition and to the new elections. Once again, Lithuania reminds Belarus to respect its international obligations and commitments, to hold genuinely democratic election and to secure human rights and fundamental freedoms, to stop immediately any assault against peaceful protesters and journalists, including their unlawful detainment, imprisonment and torture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Iceland, Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Development Cooperation, Mr. Guðlaugur Thorardsson, on behalf of Nordic countries. The floor is yours. Guðlaugur, please.
Thank you, Urmas. Your Excellency, members of the Security Council, I have the pleasure to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Iceland. We welcome today's opportunity to discuss the human rights situation in Belarus following the presidential elections of August 9th, 2020. I would like to initially thank the briefers for the insightful and first-hand remarks about the situation. The recent election in Belarus was neither free nor fair. Prior to the elections, we witnessed with deep concern the detention of prospective candidates and irregularities related to candidate registration. Despite repeated calls, the lack of a timely as well as unconditional invitation to observe the presidential elections led to the absence of independent international elections observers. The use of widespread violence against peaceful demonstrators, journalists, and other media workers in the aftermath of the elections was deeply troubling. The desire of the people of Belarus to be respected and heard in free and fair elections is a legitimate demand. The situation called for the Belarusian authorities to address the legitimate protest of the people and enter into genuine and inclusive dialogue. Instead, we witnessed indiscriminate and unjustified arrests and violence against demonstrators, journalists, and other media workers. We cannot stand idly by and hesitate in our criticism when faced with such grave human rights violations and restrictions of freedoms. We will address the situation in the Human Rights Council. The Belarusian authorities must release all unlawfully detained persons, including those detained on political grounds. We are deeply alarmed by the criminal cases opened against the Coordination Council, as well as the intimidation and detentions of its members. We call for thorough, independent, and transparent investigation into the allegation of tortures and other ill treatment of people under detentions. All perpetrators of human rights violations must be held accountable. This will be crucial in order to address the post-election grievances and achieve reconciliation. We urge the Belarusian authorities to engage with the current and incoming OSCE chairmanship in facilitating an inclusive and national dialogue in the country. Your Excellency, we respect the Belarusian people's right to choose their own path. Free and independent media and a strong civil society are the fundamental ingredients to provide sustainable solutions to the crisis in Belarus. There is no reason to be afraid of genuine democratic debate. The voices of the people of Belarus need to be heard and taken into account. In closing, we support all efforts to peacefully end the crisis, and we will continue to support a democratic, independent, sovereign, prosperous, and stable Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Romania Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Bogdan Aurescu. Please.
Dear Chair, dear Urmas, dear colleagues and briefers, I thank Estonia for organizing this Arria Formula meeting, which Romania is co-sponsoring. It is timely and more than opportune in the light of the ongoing political crisis in Belarus. Mr. Chair, disregarding all personal risks, the citizens of Belarus took to the streets to demand respect for their fundamental rights, freedom of speech, fair and free elections, freedom to make their own choices for a better life in, I stress it, a democratic, sovereign and independent Belarus. As a Romanian, I can point out that we have seen such national awakening on the streets of Timișoara, Bucharest and many other cities of my country 30 years ago. Our experience and others prove that when people go to the streets in such large numbers, representing all parts of the society, it is a clear indication that new beginnings should be allowed to fully ascend. The recourse to violence and repression and turning a deaf ear to calls for genuine dialogue are simply not acceptable. Favoring repression instead of genuine dialogue cannot bring lasting solutions, but risks to produce more suffering and great losses for all sides. The world stood in admiration of the people of Belarus, represented by you, Mrs. Tsikhanouskaya, and of the courageous journalists. You called on the world community to support the very principles and norms the United Nations stand for, and we are bound to react. Along with the EU and its member states, Romania has condemned the violations of human rights, did not recognize the results of the elections, and called for release of all politically motivated detainees, along with a swift commencement of political dialogue. We also support sanctioning by the EU of those responsible for the repression and election fraud, and look for ways to uphold civil society and free media in Belarus. To this end, as I have previously announced in Berlin at last week's Gymnich reunion, Romania will allocate 100,000 euros to the European Endowment for Democracy to fund specific projects in Belarus in support of the civil society and independent media. But more needs to be done by all of us, especially in political terms, in all relevant fora, also here at the UN, and also from the part of the UN Security Council members themselves, in order to respond to the expectations of the Belarusian people. The OSCE Chairmanship in Office Albania, together with the incoming Chairmanship in Office Sweden, have proposed to go to Minsk to promote dialogue, a proposal favored by a majority of states. We still hold the view that genuine political dialogue is possible and necessary. The world community needs, in fact, to properly put at work all the tools it developed to support human rights and fundamental freedoms, be they at UN, OSCE, or Council of Europe level. We also reject the accusations regarding interference in internal affairs of Belarus. This is not an issue of external interference. It is an issue of the breach of international commitments to respect the fundamental human rights and the democratic norms and principles. The people of Belarus deserve that their rights are respected, and the international community has to act efficiently. Romania will continue to call on the Belarusian authorities and its supporters to stop repression and intimidation, to start genuine dialogue with the opposition and civil society, to stop unfounded accusations against neighboring nations, and act responsibly for building social peace and prosperity based on democracy, respect for fundamental rights in the free, independent, and sovereign Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Poland, Undersecretary of State for Security, the Americas, Asia and Eastern Policy, Mr. Marcin Brzydas. Please.
Very good morning to everyone, Excellencies, dear colleagues, distinguished guests. I'd like to express my gratitude to Minister Urmas Reinsalu for initiating this timely and important meeting. I would also like to thank all distinguished speakers who briefed us on the recent distressing developments in Belarus. The systemic violations of human rights in Belarus have escalated in last months, resulting in a wave of repressions against political opponents that are reported since the beginning of the presidential campaign. However, the recent scale of human rights violation by the authorities is unprecedented in the history of independent Belarus. Violence against peaceful protesters, their mass arrests and detentions, torture and ill treatment of detainees, including minors or women, are highly alarming. The Belarusian authorities show respect international law. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, and everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Therefore, we, the international community, shall be persistent in condemning the violent response of Belarusian authorities to post-electoral protests. This is why Poland, a member state of the European Union, United Nations Human Rights Council, and a country which has played a crucial role in establishing the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus, urges Belarusian authorities to immediately release all unlawfully detained and to conduct impartial investigations of all allegations of human rights violations. Ladies and gentlemen, the unprecedented scale and duration of protests confirmed that the Belarusian nation is determined to live in a democratic country. As Poland will, in 2021, join the chairmanship troika of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, we declare our engagement in mediation process through OSCE, a potential mediator. At this moment, the Belarusian society needs a stronger international support. Poland recently launched a new program of solidarity for Belarus, worth another $20 million, offering assistance to ex-detainees, independent journalists and media, NGOs and repressed workers. We also implemented mechanisms facilitating cross-border traffic. Only inclusive dialogue between Belarusian authorities and civil society may bring resolution to the present crisis. The democratic awakening is a great chance for a prosperous Belarus and should not be seen as a threat for its sovereignty and stability. The Belarusian sovereignty is indivisible and untouchable and shall be respected by all UN members. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Ukraine Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Dmytro Kuleba. Please.
Minister Reinsalu, dear colleagues, I thank you personally for organizing and joining this important event. The information we heard from the briefers is both worrying and alarming. Ukraine, as a neighbor and a friend of Belarus, follows closely developments there, including the situation with human rights. We are deeply interested in continuing mutually beneficial dialogue and cooperation with Belarus based upon democratic values for a common and stable future in this part of Europe. We are concerned that authorities continue to deploy unacceptable violence against peaceful protesters, causing many injuries. Thousands were detained and the crackdown on freedoms intensified. Once the Belarusian authorities resorted to violence against peaceful protesters, foreign ministers of the Lublin Triangle countries, Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine, issued a statement in which we expressed deep concern with escalation, called upon authorities to refrain from the use of force and to release all those detained. I would like to recall that we also offered any assistance or good offices in facilitating dialogue in Belarus. I regret that our joint voice was not heard. Instead, we hear groundless accusations from Minsk, and I particularly regret hearing them as a friend and a good neighbor of Ukraine. We were forced to recall our ambassador in Belarus for consultations in Kyiv to consider the future of our bilateral relations. And we also were forced to put on hold all bilateral contacts at the highest and high political level. Dear colleagues, Ukraine believes that respect for human rights and dialogue are two pillars needed for the restoration of stability in Belarus. It is important to prevent further political persecution of opponents and those who took to the streets to demonstrate their position, and to thoroughly investigate all allegations of the use of force against peaceful protesters. Ukraine welcomes the joint proposal of the current Albanian and incoming Swedish OSCE chairmanship in office to pay a visit to Belarus to meet with representatives of the government and opposition, and we support such a dialogue. Speaking about mediation, I would also like to underline that it should be considered purely as an assistance. No one is imposing anything on Belarus. In our view, it is absolutely unacceptable to intervene in internal affairs, including elections. Ukraine never interfered in Belarusian affairs. We are not interfering, and we will never interfere in internal affairs of Belarus. I hope that every country, first of all Russia, will follow the suit and refrain from activities, including intervention, which might further destabilize situation in a neighboring country. Ukraine stands ready to help Belarus overcome current crisis without weakening its sovereignty and independence. Stable and democratic development of Belarus is crucial for its own citizens, for neighboring Ukraine, and for a broader Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Latvia, Parliamentary Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Zanda Kalnina Lukasevica, please.
Excellencies, dear Ms. Marin, dear Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Estonia for convening this meeting. The presidential elections in Belarus on the 9th of August were neither free nor fair. Several presidential candidates had been denied the possibility of registering their candidacies. We regret the widespread vote fraud. International observers from the OSCE and the Council of Europe were not able to monitor the elections. The violence against post-election protests is not acceptable. Many protesters have been badly beaten while in custody. Several protesters have died. We ask that the independent investigations be conducted of alleged cases of torture and ill treatment of detainees. Belarusian authorities have detained journalists and stripped many of them of press credentials, including journalists, representing major international media outlets. We are deeply concerned that the authorities regularly block access to the internet. Latvia is highly concerned that the authorities of Belarus are putting pressure on religious congregations and structures, which they suspect of sympathizing with the opposition. It is particularly outrageous that Archbishop of Minsk Mogilev, the citizen of Belarus, was not allowed to return to his own country. The President, the Prime Minister, the Parliament, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Latvia have condemned the vote rigging and the violence against peaceful demonstrations. The government of Latvia will provide 150,000 euros for Latvian NGOs to assist Belarus civil society in various areas: legal, practical, medical, and psychological, as well as for strengthening independent media. Latvia, together with the other Baltic states, has put in place a travel ban against 30 Belarusian officials responsible for brutal suppression of fundamental rights. This is a clear signal that the falsification of presidential elections, beating of peaceful protesters, and persecution of journalists and human rights activists in Belarus is not acceptable, and that those responsible for such acts are not welcome. We call on the UN Human Rights Council to convene an extraordinary session on the Belarus crisis. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights should be requested to establish and dispatch a fact-finding mission on human rights abuses with a view to ensuring full accountability. Latvia supports the work of the United Nations Resident Coordinator in Belarus, and we ask the Belarusian authorities for constructive engagement. Latvia supports the proposal of the chairperson in office of the OSCE and the incoming chairperson in office to pay a visit to Belarus. We ask the Belarusian authorities to accept this initiative. We ask the representative of freedom of the media to react immediately to the violation of the freedom of media. Most importantly, we urge the Belarusian authorities to stop persecution of peaceful protesters and to release all those who have been unfairly detained without delay. We call upon the Belarusian government to immediately engage in a genuine political dialogue with opposition and civil society. Finally, we believe that the best way forward is through new presidential elections in the presence of international observers. Latvia supports an independent and democratic Belarus, and we stand by its people. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Canada. Permanent representative, Mr. Bob Rae, please.
Thank you very much, Foreign Minister. And I want to begin by thanking very much the interveners who I think have really provided us with information and with an education about the election process itself, the nature of democracy in the country at the moment, as well as the very serious evidence of the most fundamental breaches of human rights. We're all familiar with the arguments that say that in what happens inside a country is that country's own business. But the reality is we have signed the charter. We are all here because of the charter. We're here because of the Declaration on Human Rights. We're here because of the conventions against torture. That's what gives us our structure and our right to speak and our right to know and our right to engage with the government of Belarus, as well as with the people of Belarus. I want to thank in particular Madame Tsikhanouskaya, who's spoken to us, Mr. Stefanovic, Ms. Siakhovich, and as well as the rapporteur. I think the evidence that they brought to bear is something that none of us can ignore. We take the violation of human rights, in particular the evidence of torture, with the utmost of seriousness. We have no ability to ignore this evidence or to step aside and say that we're not going to discuss it. I want to thank the government of Estonia for giving us this opportunity to speak with one another and for giving us the opportunity to hear this dialogue and to respond to it. We, as Canadians, take very seriously the human rights breaches that have clearly taken place. There's no reason to believe that the election can be regarded as either free or fair, as many others have said. We have to recognize the abuses against freedom of speech, against freedom of association, against the right to demonstrate peacefully, the risks to human security that this represents for all of us, and so we must respond. At the very least, at the moment, the authorities have to engage in a dialogue with their people of their own country. There has to be a release of detainees, and clearly there's a need for an independent investigation. There are many ways in which we can go forward together, but one thing is absolutely clear, and that is that we cannot, in our country, nor we believe can any other country, ignore abuses of this nature and to this extent. And that is why we are participating in this meeting. That's why we're here, and that's why we're engaging. We think it's important for all of us to do so. Thank you once again for the opportunity to speak to you. We appreciate it a great deal.
Thank you. Allow me now to make a statement in my national capacity. We are following events in Belarus with deep concern and sadness. Political persecution in Belarus started months before the 9th of August election day. After forged elections, the people went to the streets to demand new and fair elections peacefully. The authorities responded with unprecedented brutality and mass violence. And we have learned about massive torture, enforced disappearance, rape, and other forms of horror and humiliation. These are crimes against peaceful protesters. Human rights organizations say that almost every detainee has reported a disproportionate use of force and a denial of the opportunity to report their whereabouts to relatives or a lawyer. To this day, the fate of many is unknown. UN human rights experts call this week for an end to torturing detainees. They fear that cases of enforced disappearance may proliferate should the heavy-handed response to peaceful protests continue. Last weekend's news of the withdrawal of accreditation of foreign media outlets show how important it is to share information about what is happening in Belarus. The continued targeting of journalists through arrests and revoking accreditation, the blocking of independent media websites and internet shutdowns are an alarming reality, and it makes it even more urgent to provide a platform and listen to those whose voices are being silenced. I and many of you have received countless pleas for help from the Belarusian diaspora. The Belarusian authorities must stop the violence and threats to use military force against peaceful protesters. The authorities must ensure an immediate and unconditional release of all those detained unlawfully. Intimidation and prosecution based on political grounds has to end. The prohibition against torture is absolute under international human rights law and can't be justified under any circumstances. There is a need for a complete and transparent investigation of all abuses in order to hold those responsible to account. Only this will create the conditions for a peaceful and inclusive political dialogue nationally. The future of Belarus is in the hands of the people of Belarus. The Coordination Council, which consists of representatives of different parts of the society, could be instrumental in paving the way for a genuine and inclusive national dialogue. Unfortunately, the authorities have opened a criminal case against the Coordination Council and have intimidated and detained its members. There can be no national dialogue when one side is under arrest and when civil society is being repressed. The people of Belarus have the right to determine their own future. I express solidarity with the people of Belarus in their desire to exercise their fundamental democratic rights. Dear colleagues, distinguished ministers, briefers and ambassadors, it's too often that we witness moments of stalemate between the people and dictators. And we have seen what happens when free and fair elections fail and when the legitimate grievances of people are not met. That is why the UN Security Council has often made calls for free and fair elections. Examples from history show that early action can play a positive role in preventing bloodshed and steering both sides toward a peaceful outcome. History also demonstrates that keeping our voices down sends a signal to perpetrators to keep doing what they are doing. And this is why Estonia has imposed sanctions on Belarusian officials who have had a central role in falsifying election results and using violence against peaceful protesters. With today's meeting, we make it loud and clear. We are closely following the grave human rights violations in Belarus. This Council shall remain engaged with the situation and receive updates if the developments so require. Let me full-heartedly support the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Belarus. Dear Belarusians, Estonia, all freedom-loving people stand in solidarity with you, and we admire your peaceful resolve. We support peaceful, democratic dialogue, transition, and free and fair elections. Václav Havel has rightly said that truth and love will overcome lies and hatred. Democratic legitimacy will never rise from fraud and falsification. Thus, let us speak up for and let us not lose interest in the suffering of the Belarusian people. Thank you. I now invite the representatives of the Security Council member states to take the floor. And the first is Germany, Deputy Permanent Representative, Mr. Günther Sauter, please. Excuse me, you are mute. Please put the mic on.
Foreign Minister Urmas Reinsalu, thank you very much for convening this meeting on the latest developments and on the human rights situation in Belarus, which remains a cause of deep concern. We pay tribute to the courageous people of Belarus who keep standing up for their democratic rights and are braving brutal violence, arbitrary arrest, and other human rights violations. I would like to make 3 points. The first one is on elections. In light of the results and the way of conducting the elections in Belarus, the reaction of the population is no surprise. These elections were neither free nor fair. Therefore, we do not recognize the results as presented by the Belarus Central Election Commission. An independent assessment mission must be pursued, for example, by the OSCE. My second point is on the violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms. We are shocked to see the excessive use of force by police across Belarus in the face of peaceful protests. This is deplorable. We call on a prompt and effective investigation of all acts of brutal police misconduct in order to hold the responsible persons to account. We are particularly alarmed by the arbitrary arrests and allegations of serious human rights violations in detention centers. We call for the immediate release of all unlawfully detained people. The continuing attacks on freedom of the media, among them journalists from Germany, represent another regrettable step towards more repression instead of a dialogue with the population. We have clearly conveyed this message to the ambassador of Belarus in Berlin earlier this week. All countries across the OSCE region have committed to hold genuinely democratic elections and to uphold human rights and fundamental freedoms. We are, like others, convinced that the Human Rights Council needs to address the situation in Belarus. As European Union, we have made clear that these violations of OSCE standards in human rights are unacceptable. The EU agreed to reimpose well-calibrated sanctions against those responsible for police violence and for these fraudulent elections. Within the European Union, we are reviewing our relations with Belarus. Our focus will be on the people first, on respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. My third point is on conflict resolution through inclusive national dialogue. We call on the Belarusian authorities to find a way out of the crisis by bringing about an end to violence and by engaging in a genuine and inclusive national dialogue. Last week's special meeting of the Permanent Council of the OSCE has clearly demonstrated to us that the OSCE is ready to provide assistance to further these efforts. Germany fully supports the proposal of the OSCE chairperson in office, Prime Minister and Minister of Europe and Foreign Affairs of Albania, Edi Rama, and the incoming OSCE chairperson in office, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden, Ann Linde, to pay a visit to Belarus and to meet with the government and representatives of civil society and opposition. We urge the government of Belarus to accept this offer. Don't miss the opportunity to take up a genuine dialogue with the people of Belarus, notably with the Coordination Council. The European Union stands ready to provide assistance to facilitating a national dialogue. This must be underpinned by independent and free media and a vibrant civil society. Journalists must be able to report freely and unhindered. Citizens must be allowed to peacefully express their views and to freely assemble. In conclusion, it is crucial that we help find a political solution to the current crisis involving all stakeholders. We stand ready to contribute to efforts to peacefully end the crisis. Now is the time for those in power in Belarus to take up the OSCE's offer to facilitate an inclusive and credible dialogue with the people of Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is France, Permanent Representative Mr. Nicolas de Rivière, please.
Thank you very much, Minister Ministers, Excellencies, and dear representatives of the civil society of Belarus, France supports the aspirations of the Belarusian people to freedom, sovereignty, and respect for their fundamental rights. The protests in Belarus are not about geopolitics. They are about the right of the people to freely elect their leadership. Such protests cannot be silenced through violence and repression. Therefore, France condemns the violence against the peaceful protesters following the contested presidential election of August 9 in Belarus. The reports of human rights violations gathered by the Special Rapporteur on Belarus, including torture, ill treatment, and enforced disappearance, are of particular concern. All political prisoners and peaceful demonstrators arrested in connection with the demonstrations must be released unconditionally and immediately. We expect a complete and transparent investigation into all alleged abuses. The OSCE, and more particularly the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, has the legitimacy and the expertise to investigate arbitrary measures taken against journalists and media workers, endanger press freedom, and have to be suspended. These repressive measures won't help the current crisis. The European Union has clearly expressed its position on the elections, which were neither free nor fair and did not meet international standards. The European Union has decided to impose sanctions on a number of senior officials directly responsible for election fraud, violence, and repression. In addition, the Commission will allocate 53 million euros as part of the European Neighbourhood and Partnership Instrument to support the people of Belarus. Human rights violations in Belarus are in large part linked to the current political crisis. This crisis can only be resolved in a way that respects democratic principles and fundamental rights and freedom. Belarus, being a member of the OSCE, we think that Belarus should abide to OSCE standards, and we think that the OSCE chairmanships in office proposal to visit and facilitate a dialogue should be accepted by the authorities. France will remain mobilized alongside its partners to find a peaceful solution to this crisis. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Belgium. Permanent representative, Mr. Philip Kridelka, please.
Thank you, Minister. On 9th of August, the Belarusian people took to the polling stations in order to demonstrate their desire for democratic change. Together with its European Union partners, Belgium deeply regrets that these elections were neither free nor fair, as the electoral process did not meet the international standards to be expected of an OSCE participating state. The Belarus authorities should immediately address the lack of impartiality of the election administration, and any instance of malpractice should be investigated and remedied. We also reiterate the ODIHR recommendation to reform the appointment procedures of all election commissions in order to increase their independence, impartiality, and effectiveness. The elections, Minister, were followed by a wave of peaceful protests by Belarusian citizens sharing the same wish to live freely in a country where their voices are heard, to determine their own government and to decide about their own future. They were met with intimidation and brutal force, disproportionate and unacceptable violence. We are alarmed by the recent declaration of the UN human rights experts. They received reports of 450 documented cases of torture and ill treatment of people deprived of their liberty. We all heard the experts this morning, including Madame Marin. We call for the immediate release of those who have been unlawfully detained. An immediate and unconditional improvement of the human rights situation is indeed a bare necessity. We also call for a prompt and impartial investigation into all human rights abuses, including sexual and gender-based violence. Any perpetrators of violations must be brought to justice. We call upon the authorities to, at all times, respect the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Belarusian citizens, including the freedoms of assembly, media, and expression. We also call upon the authorities to urgently start to conduct a genuine and inclusive dialogue with its citizens. Any further escalation must be prevented, as it will render even more difficult the future. Belgium believes the OSCE, an organization of which Belarus is a member state, and which has a well-established and relevant mandate for democracy, human rights, and conflict prevention, is well placed to assist in mediation efforts between the parties. Furthermore, Belgium calls upon the authorities to seize the Albanian-Swedish mediation offer. Both initiatives of good offices would help create conducive conditions to a useful process, a process, of course, that belongs to the Belarusian people. Mr. Minister, I would also like to recall the extraordinary meeting of the European Council on the 19th of August, calling on the Belarusian authorities to find a way out of the crisis and to uphold the respect for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law for all its citizens. As a member of the European Union and of the OSCE, Belgium will continue to closely follow the developments in Belarus. We will continue to support a democratic, independent, sovereign, prosperous, and stable Belarus. I thank you, Mr. Minister.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Russian Federation Deputy Permanent Representative, Mr. Dmitry Polyansky, please.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. We are participating in a very strange meeting today. It has clearly nothing to do with the agenda of the Security Council, as any Arria formula meeting is supposed to be. In our handbook on the working methods, it is indicated that Arrias uphold on matters which fall within the purview of responsibility of the Security Council. The situation in Belarus clearly represents no threat to international peace and security. Our meeting can't be framed as a prevention either. Otherwise, we would have to gather on tens or hundreds of situations annually whenever one of the parties that had lost elections refuses to accept defeat. As for the internal situation in Belarus, we all saw footages of disturbing police actions when it was dispersing aggressive crowds, endangering law and order in the country. No one, including Belarusian authorities, denied that these actions were not always appropriate. That's why the government and president of Belarus pledged to investigate such cases while maintaining calm in the streets and prosecuting those who use force against the law enforcement and incite violence. This is a regular scenario for a country that has government responsible for maintaining constitutional order. It is in no way different from what we see in many other parts of the globe, in France with Gilets jaunes, or in Berlin, where the protesters recently tried to break in Reichstag, or in our host country, USA, against violent protesters during Black Lives Matter gatherings. That happened in Bulgaria, where riot police 2 days ago forcefully dispersed aggressive crowds, protesting for 3 months already. But in all the above-mentioned situations, we have not seen willingness to organize Arria formula meetings and give the floor to the leaders of the protest. So why do we do it now? What is the logic behind such a move of the organizers? Will our next meeting be on police violence in the USA, with the leaders of the protest speaking in similar Arria formats? Some of them asked for it. I will recall the demand of George Floyd's brother to address the UN in July of this year. Mr. Minister, we listened carefully to Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. We hear claims that she won the elections, but who has verified it? Is this a new reality when anyone could claim him or herself an elected president? Is this a new Guaido-type scheme applicable to all the electoral situation, the outcomes of which are not acceptable to certain countries? The statements we heard did not refer to any imminent or even looming threat to international peace and security or to any planned military action by or against Belarus. So is there a point for us gathering today and discussing internal Belarusian matters? In fact, there is only one topic that is worth discussing today since we all gathered here, and it is flagrant interference of foreign powers, first and foremost Western and Southern neighbors of Belarus, in the country's internal affairs with a clear aim of regime change. These manipulations and pressures started even before the elections took place. It was at the end of July when the President of Poland, Andrzej Duda, ordered mobilization of the country's armed forces and even stated that Poland would be ready to take control of certain regions of Belarus, which belonged to Poland at some point of history. Immediately after the elections, the high officials of Estonia, including you, Mr. Minister, as well as from Latvia and Lithuania, classified them as fraudulent. After the Baltic states, several European politicians, including the head of European diplomacy, Josep Borrell, and President of the European Council, Charles Michel, also labeled elections in Belarus as fraudulent. Naturally, this assessment of immediate neighbors emboldened the protesters. How can you judge from abroad after just several hours whether elections were fraudulent or not? Especially while OSCE, which is undergoing a profound crisis, chose not to fulfill its obligations and ensure international monitoring of presidential elections in Belarus. To be more clear on this issue, we heard the allegations that Belarus refused to let international observers into the country. Let me remind the facts. Minsk did invite OSCE to monitor the process. However, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights refused to accept the invitation, claiming that it came too late. It was office's own decision not to send observers, though it displayed flexibility in similar cases with elections in Serbia on June 21, Poland, June 28, North Macedonia, July 15, and Montenegro, August 30. Mr. Minister, just a few days ago, the three Baltic states introduced unilateral sanctions against Belarus. EU is also considering this. It means that instead of promoting internal dialogue with the authorities, our European partners have clearly taken sides in this crisis. How, after that, can they seek to be intermediaries in its resolution? Especially when we all remember what happened in Ukraine after 3 EU foreign ministers deceived President Yanukovych in just a few hours after his signature of the agreement with the opposition. Like in Ukraine in 2014, the threat of alleged Russian intervention was exploited to its utmost by our Western colleagues. On August 28, we heard Lithuanian foreign minister threatening journalists in Berlin that he does not exclude Russia's military invasion in Belarus. In parallel, Lithuania announced that it will grant visas to all the oppressed Belarusians and invited them to the country to study or as a workforce. Yesterday, this minister claimed that Lithuania doesn't interfere into internal affairs of Belarus, but will continue to help those Belarusian citizens that face danger. Are we expected to apply the same approach to Baltic states, given that hundreds of thousands of Russian-speaking citizens face ethnic discrimination there? We also know that several European countries, Baltic states and Poland being champions, already pledged multi-million-dollar programs to finance social activity in Belarus, which in fact means sponsoring the regime change. In fact, there is nothing new in this scheme that could have caused indignation by any Western country, be it an object of the same efforts. It merely continues policy which has been in place vis-à-vis Belarus for many years. Mr. Minister, since Ukrainian delegation is also participating today, I can't help indicating that a lot of aggressive activities in Belarus are conducted from neighboring Ukraine, where a number of local well-known nationalists and neo-Nazi groups are involved, including Stepan Bandera, Trizub, C14, the National Corps, and the Right Sector. These groups are actively provoking radical actions in Minsk and other cities, funding related events, and inciting those whom they consider promising extremist leaders to use force during the demonstrations in the Belarusian capital. According to our information, there are camps for training such extremists in the Volyn and Dnepropetrovsk regions in Ukraine. We have evidence, which we shared with our Belarusian colleagues, that about 200 extremists trained in Ukraine are now in the Republic of Belarus. They offer Belarus a Maidan scenario, which led Ukraine where it is now. Mr. Minister, what is it all, if not a direct interference into internal affairs of a UN member state? We see obvious double standards in this situation. We call on everyone to stop any interference in domestic affairs of Belarus, as well as imposing any political decisions or mediation upon this country and its leaders. It is of a principal importance for the country that the people of Belarus are given opportunity to sort out internal political problems by themselves. We cannot imagine that the initiators of today's meeting do not realize an obvious thing. Attempts to internationalize situation in Belarus can only aggravate things and deepen diversities within the societies. Only Belarusians themselves should decide the fate of their country through peaceful and constructive political dialogue. I thank you, Mr. Minister.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Dominican Republic Deputy Permanent Representative, Mr. Jean Sedano, please.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. First, I would like to thank the co-sponsoring countries for convening this meeting. We also thank the briefers for their contributions. We join the concerns expressed by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and members of the international community regarding the human rights situation in Belarus. The Dominican Republic rejects any action that involves the violation of human rights, the sacred principles of freedom, and peaceful demonstrations in any context. On the other hand, during the health crisis given by the COVID-19 pandemic, we are deeply concerned about the added grievances due to the hundreds of deaths and thousands of infected people in Belarus, which has been linked to the absence of effective preventive measures and awareness of the population about the impact of the coronavirus in all its aspects of daily life. We also recognize that at this juncture, in order to achieve social peace, political dialogue remains the most appropriate way to provide sustainable solutions, guarantee civil liberties, and respect fundamental rights of the population. We take this opportunity to remind ourselves that the capital of Belarus has been the venue of important talks and agreements for peace in the region. We would like to urge its authorities to serve as an example of tolerance and coexistence in line with this history. We call on them also to take the necessary measures urgently to avoid a further escalation and refrain from actions that could violate in any way the rights of the people to peacefully express themselves. First and foremost, by abstaining from the use of force and repressive measures, releasing the detainees, preventing enforced disappearances, and upholding at all times the democratic values and the spirit of the United Nations Charter. Finally, we firmly believe that in the principles that guarantee democratic processes. We hope that those responsible for violating human rights during the popular demonstrations will be identified and brought to justice. All stakeholders in the Belarusian society must join together in a national, inclusive, and credible political dialogue that gives response to the popular demands. The will of the Belarusian people must be respected and protected. Thank you, Mr. Minister.
Thank you. And the next speaker is China Deputy Permanent Representative, Mr. Shuang Geng, please.
Thank you, Minister, for giving me the floor. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by reiterating that what is happening now in Belarus is the country's internal affairs and does not pose any threat to regional or international peace and security. China is against Security Council's discussion on this matter. China respects the development path chosen by the people of Belarus, which suits their national conditions. We firmly support Belarus' effort to safeguard its national independence, sovereignty, security, and development. Meanwhile, we firmly oppose any interference in the country's internal affairs by external forces. The current situation in Belarus is gradually coming down. It's our hope, and we have full confidence that political stability and social tranquility will be restored in Belarus under the leadership of President Lukashenko and with the collective efforts of the Belarusian people. The international community should uphold the purposes and the principles of the UN Charter and abide by the basic norms governing international relations. Any attempt by external force to create social division and unrest in Belarus should be rejected. Any attempt to interfere with other countries' internal affairs in the name of human rights should be rejected as well. Maintaining the stability of Belarus is in the interest of the region and beyond. We call on the international community to play a constructive role in this regard. I thank you, Minister.
Thank you. And we have heard the Security Council members, and we will continue the event. We will now proceed with statements from other member states of the United Nations. And first, I will give the floor to Ireland Minister for Foreign Affairs and for Defence, Mr. Simon Coveney, please.
Thank you very much, Urmas, and thank you for convening today's meeting. A commitment to human rights and an understanding that respect for human rights is critical to ensuring peaceful and just societies is deeply ingrained in the Irish psyche. It's a commitment and understanding that stems from our own history and is guided, of course, by the UN Charter. It is with the UN Charter in mind, and as an incoming member of the Security Council, that I must express my deep concern regarding events in Belarus since the flawed presidential elections in early August. The elections were neither fair nor free, and we have seen unacceptable state violence against peaceful protesters, indiscriminate detentions, crackdowns on media freedom, and severe injuries, including loss of life. The whereabouts of missing persons, reports of the poor treatment of detainees, images of their injuries are all gravely troubling. The international community must continue to press the Belarusian authorities to respect fundamental freedoms and insist unequivocally on the protection of the Belarusian people's basic human rights. Ireland and our EU partners maintain our call for the immediate and unconditional release of the many protesters and political activists who remain unjustly detained. Ireland also shares the concerns expressed by the Special Rapporteur, and we regret that Belarus continues to deny her access to the country in her official capacity. I urge the Belarusian authorities to accept the offer of the OSCE chair to visit Minsk and facilitate a national dialogue. Day after day, week after week, the Belarusian people have shown remarkable resilience in defense of their own democratic rights. We must make it clear that violence, falsified elections, and curtailment on the freedom of expression are not acceptable. We're also clear on our commitment to support the Belarusian people and civil society, including through working with our EU partners to highlight the grave human rights situation in Belarus at the forthcoming session of the HRC in Geneva. But to be clear, the future of Belarus is for its people and its people alone to decide. What is happening in Belarus should not be about geopolitics. It has to be about the right of the Belarusian people to freely choose their own political leaders. We want to see, like many others, a peaceful and democratically legitimate outcome to this worrying period. And we think that this meeting helps in those efforts So thank you once again, Urmas.
Thank you. And the next speaker is North Macedonia, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Bujar Osmani, please.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome the initiative of Estonia to convene this informal virtual briefing of the UN Security Council on the situation in Belarus as an opportunity to hear from first-hand sources about the human rights situation following the elections in the country on the 9th August. But before I continue, let me reassure you of my wish and readiness as newly appointed Minister for Foreign Affairs of North Macedonia to contribute to the joint endeavors in promoting peace and stability globally, in Europe, and in the region of Southeast Europe. Colleagues, as members of the United Nations, we are bound by a UN Charter to safeguard and promote peace, stability, and prosperity. Unfolding events in Belarus clearly represents a threat to these commitments. First, presidential elections which took place on 9th August did not comply with the international commitments of Belarus and recognize standards of democracy, and as such, they cannot be deemed as free and fair. We join others, notably the EU, in expressing regrets and concerns in these regards. Secondly, events following the elections pose challenge to the peace and stability in Europe. Excessive use of force in the face of peaceful protests, arbitrary detentions, reports of torture and intimidation and detention of journalists are not acceptable in Europe of 21st century. Belarus is an OSCE participating state with clear commitments, and it is also a member of a number of Council of Europe agreements, which at their core have the principles laid down in the European Convention on Human Rights. North Macedonia joins others in condemning this affront to human rights in the country, and similarly is calling for thorough, transparent, and impartial investigation into all human rights violations in order to hold those responsible to account. We echo the call of the EU and others in requesting the Belarusian authorities to find a way out of the crisis by bringing an end to violence and engaging in a genuine and inclusive national dialogue. Only a peaceful and democratic process, underpinned by independent and free media and a strong civil society, can provide sustainable solutions. In this regard, North Macedonia supports the proposal of the OSCE Chairperson in Office, Prime Minister and Minister for European and Foreign Affairs of Albania, Edi Rama, and the incoming OSCE Chairperson in Office, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden, Anne Lind, to pay a visit to Belarus and to meet with the government and representatives of the opposition. We hope that Belarusian authorities will engage quickly, constructively, and meaningfully. We are all friends of Belarus. We support Belarusian independence and sovereignty, as well as the aspiration of the Belarusian people for a democratic, prosperous future. To achieve these goals, the government of Belarus must prove through action its commitment to democratic processes and respect for human rights. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Slovenia, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dr. Anđelko Logar, please.
Thank you, Estonia, for organizing this very timely and useful event, and as well the guest speakers, including Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, for their presentation in sharing with us first-hand information about the situation on the ground. People of Belarus are peacefully demanding respect for the fundamental principles and values, namely human dignity, self-determination, political and civil rights, rule of law, and accountable government. The use of force by the authority is unacceptable. The events in Belarus demand active engagement and response of the international community. We continue to express our strong solidarity with the people of Belarus. Only peaceful and truly inclusive national dialogue can resolve the crisis in Belarus. including possible new democratic election with presence of a strong international observation mission. Having in mind the violation of basic democratic norms and manipulation of election result and the increasing violation of freedom of expression and media freedom, and under Chapter 8 of the UN Charter for our unified engagement in the OSCE and the Council of Europe is necessary. In particular, the OSCE is well placed to seek solution to the present crisis in Belarus. We thus urge Belarus to enter into dialogue with OSCE and accept the offer of the current and incoming chairman in office, Albania and Sweden, aiming to facilitate and support the dialogue. The dialogue is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Bulgaria Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Milan Luchkanov, please.
Dear Minister Reinsalu, esteemed members of the United Nations Security Council, dear colleagues and friends, please allow me to extend my appreciation to the United Nations Security Council members Estonia, United Kingdom, and the United States, as well as to all co-sponsors and guests for their efforts to organize this timely debate on the latest developments in Belarus, which we have been following very closely and with increasing concern. The present Arria formula meeting is another tangible proof of our genuine solidarity with the Belarusian people and an opportunity to hear the victims' voices. On the eve of the presidential elections in Belarus, the EU and many of the world leaders and organizations repeatedly raised their concerns about the lack of willingness by the Belarusian authorities to show progress on the implementation of the OSCE ODIHR recommendations for electoral reform and to invite international observers in due time. Deep concerns were also expressed about a series of irregularities, including these related to candidate registrations. Throughout the whole election campaign in Belarus, we have witnessed an unprecedented mobilization of the Belarusian civil society, which has been guided in this struggle by a sincere will for free and fair elections and for change. Yet again, Belarusian citizens have faced the reluctance of the authorities to respect their fundamental freedoms. This was evidenced by the shocking reports of excessive use of force by police throughout the country in response to entirely peaceful protests. Ladies and gentlemen, for all that, Bulgaria supported the assessment that the elections were neither free nor fair, and therefore we do not recognize the official election results. We strongly condemn the persisting attacks against the freedom of opinion and expression of the assault on media independence and pluralism in Belarus. The use of this disproportionate force and unacceptable violence against peaceful protesters and the detention of opposition supporters and media workers are unacceptable. Bulgaria calls on the Belarusian government to release immediately and unconditionally all political prisoners and detainees. We expect a thorough and transparent investigation into all alleged abuses in order to hold those responsible to account. We encourage the Belarusian authorities to launch a genuine political dialogue with the opposition and with the broader civil society in order to prevent further escalation. There is no alternative to an inclusive national dialogue in Belarus. The criminal cases filed against the Coordination Council, as well as the intimidation and detention of its members, is unfortunately a step into the opposite direction. We strongly believe that the Coordination Council could be one of the instruments for paving the way for a genuine and inclusive national dialogue. We bring attention to the right of the friendly Belarusian people to determine their own democratic future. We also encourage the conducting of an in-depth review of the EU's relations with Belarus, including the consideration of targeted sanctions against those accountable for the violence, the unjustified arrests, and the falsification of election results. As agreed with our EU member state colleagues, only a peaceful and democratic process, including genuinely democratic elections, underpinned by independent and free media and a strong civil society, can provide sustainable solutions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Slovakia, State Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign European Affairs, Ms. Ingrid Prochkova, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for organizing this important meeting on human rights in Belarus. I also wish to thank all briefers for their insightful contributions. The content of the briefings is an ample proof of this issue should stay high on the radar screen of the international community. It is not about big politics. It is about the people of Belarus who long for better life. They deserve it. Slovakia is closely following the situation in Belarus, and the Slovak society has shown many expressions of solidarity. This is also a reminder that freedom is not for granted. I suppose that today nobody believes that presidential elections in Belarus were either free or fair. On the contrary, they brought Belarus at the crossroad. The people of Belarus were deprived of their legitimate right to express their views freely. Moreover, the regime brutally cracked down on peaceful protesters. This does not change the fact that the current regime has lost its legitimacy. Furthermore, the regime tries to use the narrative of Western interference for even more violence against the peaceful protesters. Though the protesters in Belarus do not have a geopolitical character, it is not either Russia or West EU logic. Slovakia is deeply concerned over the reports about the violent response of the regime in the aftermath of the presidential elections. Thousands of people detained when protesting peacefully, many of them severely tortured and ill-treated, including the minors, let alone the numbers of people still missing. Such practice is simply unacceptable. The international community cannot be muted when the human rights are violated. We welcome the response of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as the UN human rights experts on the situation in Belarus. Slovakia encourages them to monitor the situation in the country further and report. What should be the next? First and utmost, the government of Belarus has to immediately end the violence and restore human rights and freedom. All those responsible for violence must be held to account. All those arrested have to be set free immediately. We urge Belarusian authorities to engage in a meaningful and constructive dialogue and cooperation with the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus. Second, conflict resolution and reconciliation through an inclusive national dialogue in order to create conditions for free and fair presidential elections. Slovakia considers the OSCE the only international entity that can meaningfully facilitate any inclusive dialogue in Belarusian society. OSCE and its autonomous institutions can equally use their wide toolbox of action, advice, activities in areas like conflict prevention or resolution, also in the area of human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of expression and freedom of the media. Slovakia, as a member of the OSCE Troika, is ready to make every possible step so that OSCE could be used in the best possible way, also in order to improve the human rights situation in Belarus. Third, bilaterally, we are also ready to help. The Slovak government just a few days ago approved to provide the finance, the assistance for students in Belarus. Last but not least, we should be celebrating all together courage of all the brave women in Belarus who are making the history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Croatia State Secretary for European Affairs, Ms. Andrea Metelko-Zgombic, please.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Croatia has been following the latest developments in Belarus very closely and with great concern. The gravity of the situation on the ground makes this meeting timely and provides us a valuable opportunity to hear about the human rights situation in Belarus from first-hand sources. We are deeply thankful for their courage and determination in bringing to light the truth for all those who are suffering the consequences of repression. Belarusian authorities practice persecution, arbitrary arrest and detention on questionable grounds of political opponents, members of civil society, human rights defenders, journalists, and media workers from the beginning of the election campaign in June until now. Croatia expresses deep regret and concern that peaceful protests after the elections have been met with such disproportionate repression and use of force, including unlawful arrest and arbitrary detention. We find particularly concerning the reports of beating and torture of detainees, both women and men, poor conditions in prisons and detention centers, as well as allegations of torture and inhumane and degrading treatment or punishment of persons solely for having organized or taking part in protests. Croatia joins plea of the international community for the immediate release of all those arbitrarily detained and of all political prisoners. We firmly support the right of Belarusian people to choose their leaders and determine their own fate, and we join them in their call for new and free elections in Belarus, organized under the supervision of the independent observers. We call on the government of Belarus to find a way out of this crisis through an end of violence, de-escalation, and inclusive national dialogue. We expect Belarus to fully respect, protect, and fulfill its obligations pursuant to international human rights law. Croatia strongly supports the joint approach towards the situation in Belarus and stands ready to contribute to any efforts in peacefully ending the crisis. Thank you, Mr. Minister.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Spain State Secretary for Foreign Affairs and for Iberoamerica and the Caribbean, Ms. Cristina Calach Figueras, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much to all the speakers who have given us a very comprehensive vision of human rights situation in Belarus. Distinguished delegates, it is important for the Council to be aware of the situation with first-hand information, since we cannot assume that serious long-term human rights violations will not eventually turn into a conflict with international implications. No one here wants that, but this is not a matter of will, hence our support to this initiative led by Estonia of the debate in the Security Council. What happens in Belarus is closely related to Spain. We are both European states, we have friendly bilateral relations, as well as growing economic ties. But above all, we are linked through our civil societies. Over 5,000 citizens of Belarus reside in Spain, a model community perfectly well integrated in our country. Many of them have these last days written to us, to this ministry, very concerned, in fact, extremely concerned about the situation in their homeland. Mr. Chairman, from the night of the election, the situation in Belarus has been a concern, not only in a good number of chancelleries, but also for the international public opinion. A few days after the election, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Bachelet, issued a condemnation of the violent reaction of the authorities to peaceful demonstrations, as well as the constraints to freedom of expression. The accounts we have heard today confirm our initial assessment of the situation on the ground. The stories and figures presented by the speakers portrait that we unequivocally must reject. We need to call for an end and demand thorough and complete investigation of these events. It is important to point out that these demonstrations were spontaneously born from civil society. They are horizontal and in no way manipulated or instigated from afar. Ms. Tsikhanouskaya and the opposition leaders are symbols of change. And change is, this instance, is not a geopolitical shift. Change is upholding respect to the most essential values of the rule of law. There is indeed no geographical afterthought when we demand to cease all violence, to hold an inclusive national dialogue with free and independent media and a strong civil society. Spain definitely supports this kind of change without any hidden agenda. This inclusive national dialogue will not happen if the National Coordination Council is criminalized, when representatives of civil society are silent. Democracy drowns instead of thriving. One of the representatives, Mr. Latushko, is well known in Spain, where he was recently ambassador of Belarus. Mr. Latushko has received multiple threats. His mother and daughter have had to flee the country, their own country. I would like to take this opportunity to express my solidarity, the solidarity of the whole Spanish government and society with him and his family, as well as many other anonymous citizens and civil servants of Belarus who just want to uphold the law. Mr. Chairman, these no citizens, some of them unfortunately deceased in the last few weeks, have been screaming for us to listen to them. The Nobel laureate Svetlana Alexievich is very familiar with the quote-unquote official tales. In the unwomanly phase of war, she wove a tale from the daily experience of humble voices, of unknown, simple characters. I am pleased to realize that the Council does not turn its back to those voices who are today in Belarus asking to be heard. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Belarus. Permanent Representative, Mr. Valentin Rybakov, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, colleagues, we respect the United Nations Security Council as the principal UN body with a core function to, and I quote, maintain international peace and security, unquote. Credibility and reputation of the Security Council should therefore be respected and protected. While open for inclusive and constructive dialogue, we will never accept attempts by other member states to abuse the Security Council's authority, including by convening unofficial meetings like today, to earn political points by applying selective approach. Such attempts go against provisions of the United Nations Charter because human rights topics must be considered by respective United Nations bodies with a very clear and transparent mandate to do so. The intention allegedly is to give voice to those who are deprived of it. We expect, therefore, that the voice at the Security Council will also be now given to those from other countries, the countries that have recently faced or continue to face, even today, similar domestic problems, including, incidentally, some of the countries that so actively participate in this informed event. Following presidential elections in Belarus, political emotions, fueled up by outside interference, resulted in protests, some of them violent. An interagency commission, as you all know, was set up in Belarus to ensure a legal assessment of the actions of all those involved. Future of Belarus, and we stress this, emphasize this, future of Belarus will be decided by its own people, as we have proved time and again throughout our history. Outside interference will never be tolerated by Belarusian authorities. We urge our foreign partners to show wisdom and impartiality. Interference into our internal affairs, sanctions, or national restrictive measures against Belarus will be harmful to all. We call on all countries to abide by international law and basic norms of international relations and to observe the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And the next speaker is European Union Head of Delegation, Mr. Olof Skog, please.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union. I wanted to start by thanking you, the Estonian presidency, for organizing the meeting. You're absolutely right that the human rights situation and the general political situation in Belarus is of great concern and deserves the attention of the United Nations Security Council. And I also want to thank the four briefers for their interventions. Mr. President, the EU has followed the development in Belarus closely and with increasing concern. On 14th of August, EU foreign ministers emphasized that the elections were neither free nor fair and that the results have been falsified. Ministers underlined that the EU cannot accept the results of the election as presented by the Belarusian Central Election Commission and agreed on the need to sanction those responsible for violence, repression, and the falsification of the elections. On 19th of August, the European heads of state and government reaffirmed this firm line, calling on the Belarusian authorities to find a way out of the crisis through an end to violence, de-escalation, and an inclusive national dialogue. We appreciate the Albanian OSCE chairmanship in office offer to support dialogue in Belarus by a joint visit with the incoming OSCE chairperson in office, Sweden. Only a peaceful and democratic process underpinned by independent and free media and a strong civil society can provide sustainable solutions. External interference that doesn't respect the democratic will of the people of Belarus must be avoided. It is for the Belarusian people to determine their country's future. Unfortunately, the situation is not improving. People remain in detention. Some are even victims of torture. Some are still missing, many recovering from traumas, as we've heard today. We continue to condemn violence, to call for release of the remaining unlawfully detained protesters, as well as those imprisoned on political grounds, and demand prosecution of those responsible for those crimes. Freedom of assembly, expression, and media lie at the heart of every democratic society. Regretfully, Belarusian authorities have again failed to respect these values throughout the entire process of presidential elections. Since August 9, access to internet has regularly been blocked. We're also worried about the criminal case launched against the Coordination Council and arrests of the 3 of its members. The Coordination Council, which consists of representatives of different parts of society, reached out to the authorities for dialogue, and the authorities answered with opening of a criminal case, another example of intimidation based on political grounds. It is against this background, Mr. President, that we will assess the Belarusian authorities' actions to address the current situation, and we will conduct an in-depth review of the European Union's relations with Belarus. This will include, inter alia, taking measures against those responsible for the absurd violence, unjustified arrests, and falsification of election results. At the same time, the EU will look at how to increase our support to the Belarusian people and civil society, to independent media, and how to increase opportunities for student and academic mobility. Excellent proposals to this effect has been made by the briefers today. Mr. President, the EU appeals to Belarusian authorities to guarantee the exercise of full political rights of its citizens, to avoid using force against peaceful protesters, to refrain from further detentions of peaceful protesters and candidates, and immediately release all activists, human rights defenders, bloggers, and journalists detained on political grounds. Only through upholding human rights, democracy, and free elections will guarantee stability and sovereignty in Belarus. We remain committed to strengthening our engagement with the people of Belarus. We support the independence and sovereignty of the country. Human rights and democracy will remain at the forefront of how the EU will reshape its policy towards the country. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Sweden Permanent Representative, Ms. Anna-Karin Eneström, please.
President, thank you for organizing this meeting. Our appreciation also to the briefers for their valuable update on the human rights situation in Belarus. Sweden fully aligns itself with the Nordic statement delivered by the Foreign Minister of Iceland. We support the statement by the European Union. I want to make a few brief remarks on behalf of the incoming OSCE chairman in office, the Swedish Foreign Minister, Ann Linde. Sweden has closely followed the events unfolding. As incoming OSCE chairperson in office, Sweden has joined international calls on Belarus to conduct a complete and transparent investigation into all allegations of human rights violation, and to find a way out of the crisis through an end to violence, de-escalation, an inclusive, open and constructive national dialogue, and full respect for human rights. The Albanian Prime Minister and Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of Albania, Mr. Edi Rama, and the Foreign Minister of Sweden, as current and incoming OSCE chairpersons in office, have offered to facilitate a dialogue in Belarus, in line with the OSCE chairperson's prerogative to offer the organization's good offices. They have communicated their readiness to travel urgently to Minsk to meet with the government and representative of the opposition. As we have heard from the State Secretary, Slovakia, as outgoing Troika member, supports our effort. And I'd like to thank all member states that today have supported our proposal. Our offer stands. We remain convinced that the OSCE is well placed to play an important role in resolving the current crisis, especially since Belarus is a participating state. We act based on our common commitments within the OSCE. By offering to facilitate a dialogue, we are taking our responsibilities as OSCE participating state. We will continue our efforts to engage with all stakeholders and to extend our good offices to promote a dialogue. To conclude, Mr. President, we hope to see a democratic, prosperous, and stable Belarus. I thank you.
Thank you, and we will continue in a second. The next speaker is Austria Permanent Representative, Mr. Alexander Marchik, please. Please put the mic on. Your mic is mute. Sorry, you are still mute. Could you look if your mic is on? Sorry, we will take Holland and we hope we could proceed afterwards to Austria. The next speaker is Netherlands Permanent Representative, Ms. Joka Brandt, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I have to apologize for Ms. Brandt. Technical difficulties prohibit her to speak today. I will take over as her deputy. And on behalf of my minister, Stef Blok, let me thank Estonia, let me thank you for organizing this meeting, which is a timely meeting. Already 4 weeks now, we have seen images that both impress and shock. Impressive because hundreds of thousands of people asking for their voices to be heard. Especially empowering have been the images of the thousands of women stepping up. We are incredibly impressed by the courage of the people that go out on the streets, by the bravery you, Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, have shown together with others, by the work the human rights organizations and journalists do in these very difficult circumstances. Yet, we're also shocked by the large-scale electoral fraud, the police brutality, the intimidation against peaceful protesters, the violence that has costed lives, the images of torture, the arrests of protesters and journalists. Let me be clear, the Netherlands stands with the people of Belarus. Therefore, we call upon the Belarus government to immediately put an end to the violence and harassment, free the political prisoners, let the journalists do their jobs, and start an inclusive political dialogue that does justice to the legitimate wish of the Belarus people for peaceful political transition. The people of Belarus, and only the people of Belarus, should decide about the future of the country. The Coordination Council has reached out to the government. We urge the Belarusian government to engage with them. And in this regard, the Netherlands supports the proposal of the chairman in office of the OSCE to help facilitate a political dialogue with Belarus. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Czech Republic Permanent Representative, Ms. Marie Chatardova, please.
Mr. President, we wish to thank you as well as all distinguished briefers for their comprehensive and first-hand information about the human rights situation and latest developments in Belarus. We are following very closely the situation in Belarus, using all possible formal as well as informal sources of information. From this perspective, we see once again the crucial importance of independent media and strong civil society in Belarus as a direct and reliable source of information and documentation on election frauds and brutality of security forces. Further documentation of human rights violations and evidence and data collection are one of the key challenges in these days. These actors need our further support in order to raise local as well as international awareness about individual perpetrators of human rights violations. Political prisoners and people detained during the peaceful protests must be released immediately. There needs to be a thorough and independent investigation of the violence perpetrated on detainees, especially the numerous credible allegations of torture. This investigation should be carried out as soon as possible by independent experts. We call on the government of Belarus to fully address all these issues, in particular those related to the right of freedom of peaceful assembly and association, a right to equal participation in political and public affairs, and to refrain from any further harassment of its own citizens. Nowadays, we are witnessing not only repressions against Belarusian independent politicians, activists, bloggers, or journalists, but also against a wide range of ordinary citizens taking part in peaceful protests. Our support is not limited only to international fora such as OSCE and its human dimension mechanism. We have already further strengthened our concrete bilateral project and financial assistance aiming at supporting independent media and documentation coverage of the situation in Belarus, as well as the civil society and individuals in need. In closing, the Czech Republic reiterates its strong readiness to support all initiatives aiming towards documentation and improvement of the human rights situation in Belarus. After all, a real and inclusive dialogue between the regime and all actors of the society is a possible way out of the current deadlock in Belarus. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Austria Permanent Representative, Mr. Alexander Marchik. Again, let's try.
Thank you. I hope this works now. Thank you, Mr. Minister, and permit me to also thank the briefers for the comprehensive assessments of the situation in Belarus. Human rights are at the very core of Austria's foreign policy, and Austria thanks the co-sponsors for this initiative to discuss the developments in Belarus after the presidential elections on August 9. We share the grave concerns that other speakers have raised, but the conditions of the elections have not allowed the Belarusian people to have a fair vote and freely choose their political representation. The consequences of this flawed election are deeply troubling. Every day we now witness dramatic developments due to systematic political failure. Big parts of the Belarusian society are criminalized simply because they assert their rights and make use of their fundamental freedoms. This will have repercussions for many years to come. As you know, the European Union has reacted swiftly and is currently finalizing decisions on a first list of targeted sanctions. Mr. Minister, Austria condemns the disproportionate use of force in suppressing peaceful protests. This must stop. We reiterate our call to the authorities to respect fundamental freedoms and human rights, to respect and uphold the freedom of expression, online and offline, to respect the freedom of peaceful assembly and association, to stop arbitrary detentions and to release all activists, human rights defenders, and journalists detained on political grounds. No one should be criminally charged for peaceful participation in demonstrations. Following the presidential elections, there have been serious allegations of torture and other forms of ill treatment of people deprived of their liberty. In these instances, accountability is crucial and immediate measures are required to prevent any instance of torture or other ill treatment in detention. Austria is also very concerned about press freedom. Local journalists and foreign media representatives are arrested or targeted in Belarus simply because they're doing their job. The free flow of factual information builds trust and confidence, which are a prerequisite for the proper functioning of government and public service, as well as for maintaining peace and security nationally and internationally. We appeal to the authorities to ensure that access to internet and information remain open under all circumstances. Mr. Minister, this meeting today honors the numerous democracy protesters, survivors of and witnesses to blatant human rights violations. Their humanity, their dignity are a source of inspiration for all of us. We call on the international community to continue to monitor closely developments in Belarus and welcome the efforts by the current and incoming chair of the OSCE to facilitate an inclusive national dialogue between the Belarusian authorities and the society in view of achieving a peaceful, sustainable, and democratic solution based on the independence and sovereignty of Belarus.
Thank you. The next speaker is Portugal, Chargé d'Affaires, Mr. Nuno Matias, please.
Thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister. I hope you're able to hear me. At the outset, I would like to thank Estonia for convening this timely meeting and welcome the statements delivered by the initial briefers. Portugal supports the statement delivered just now by the European Union and would like to add some remarks on its national capacity. Mr. Chair, we have been following with grave concern the human rights situation in Belarus in the aftermath of the recent presidential elections. The extent of human rights abuses and lack of rule of law is not tolerable. The people of Belarus have demonstrated their desire for democratic change. However, the elections were clearly not free and fair. The repression which we have been witnessing and the state authorities' violence against peaceful protesters is unacceptable. Thousands of people were unlawfully detained, while freedom of assembly, media, and expression were seriously repressed. We call on Belarus to avoid violence and to immediately release all the unlawfully detained individuals. The protection of civil society and opposition actors should also be guaranteed. Mr. Chair, due to the complexity of the situation, we also recognize the importance of partners and neighboring countries that can help in order to find a peaceful solution to this crisis, based on dialogue with the opposition and respect for democracy. It is also fundamental that Belarus fully cooperates with the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights situation in that country. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Italy, Deputy Permanent Representative, Mr. Stefano Stefanile, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. And first off, allow me to express Italy's appreciation for this meeting, which has allowed us to focus on the recent developments in Minsk. Let me also express our support for the statement made earlier by the head of the European Union delegation. The situation in Belarus continues to be a source of concern. Italy, along with its partners, has condemned the repression against those who have been peacefully voicing their protests after the elections, and has also condemned the detention of activists and intimidations against journalists. Together with our EU partners, we have not recognized the outcome of the recent elections due to numerous manipulations and irregularities before and during the elections. We once again urge the government of Belarus to follow a path of dialogue with the opposition forces, to release all political detainees, and to work for some form of genuine political transition towards the ultimate objective of free and fair elections. We are ready to this end to support a possible OSCE role, which would guarantee impartiality as well as the respect of Belarus' independence and sovereignty. However, any international actor able to help Belarusians to conduct a serious dialogue between each other would be welcomed. The current crisis in Belarus is first and foremost about Belarus citizens and their legitimate aspirations. Anybody willing to paint it as the result of geopolitical competition is simply missing the point, or worse, trying to alter the facts. We believe that the whole international community share the interest to avoid a violent escalation in the country or a regional destabilization. Hence, our common objective should be to support the Belarusian people in this plight and facilitate a peaceful resolution through a meaningful dialogue between the government and all the opposition forces. It is not up to us to say what shape this dialogue should take, as long as it is genuine and inclusive. This is our renewed appeal to the Belarusian leadership. I thank you.
Thank you. And the final speaker is Montenegro, Director General for Multilateral Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Veljko Milonic, please.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, dear Minister, I would like to thank Estonia for organizing today's meeting and to the speakers who shared their assessments and thoughts with us. Our common goal is to protect principles on which modern democratic societies are based upon, above all, the preservation of peace and stability and the unconditional respect for human rights. That is our goal, but that is our duty. Therefore, any situation that deviates from these principles deserves the due attention of the international community. We followed with special attention recent developments related to presidential elections in Belarus. The people in Belarus have the fundamental right to elect freely their leadership without fear from violence and arbitrary restrictions. Free and fair elections present a cornerstone of every democratic, free and dignified society. Therefore, we condemn all violence, especially against peaceful protestants. Arbitrary arrests and restrictions on human rights and freedoms must not be reality of any free, stable and democratic society, so we strongly condemn such actions. Protection of fundamental rights, human rights and freedoms, including freedom of assembly, freedom of expression and media expression must be imperative. Thus, we remain deeply concerned on the reports of their gross violation and restriction in the aftermath of the Belarus elections. In that regard, it is important to conduct the impartial and transparent investigation against all misuses. We remain convinced that only a peaceful and democratic process, underpinned by independent and free media and strong civil society, can de-escalate the situation and provide sustainable solutions. We call on the Belarusian authorities to find a sustainable solution to resolve the crisis, calm the situation, and reduce tensions. It is crucial to end up violence and human rights violations as soon as possible. These actions should be followed by launching an inclusive national dialogue. In this respect, we support the OSCE proposal to facilitate the dialogue. Mr. Chair, Montenegro will continue to closely follow the situation, and we hope to see the peaceful resolve of the situation and the positive outcome for Belarus and all democratic societies. We thank you.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this meeting today. I thank you all for your participation on behalf of Estonia and all the co-sponsors. And let us continue to send out a clear message to Belarusian authorities to stop violence and listen to the legitimate demands of its people. And let us not lose interest in the suffering of Belarusian people. Thank you.